Cities in the United States used to be wealthy. This is what they looked like in the early 20th century. There were people, there was activity. Small cities too. Providence, Buffalo, New Haven, Cincinnati. Wealth created in a city used to be retained by the people who lived in that city. The owner of your grocery store was your neighbor. The senior management of the largest companies in your city also lived in your city. The revenue businesses earned in your city was deposited in banks located in your city, owned by people in your city, and employed by people in your city. So why did wealth leave cities? Wealth left cities for the same reasons it concentrated in cities. After World War II, the transportation and economic forces that drove people and wealth into the city moved rapidly in the opposite direction, outside the city. I'll focus on 3 reasons of why wealth left cities. The first is the change in business ownership structures from family-owned and operated and sole proprietors to a publicly traded company. Prior to World War I, most businesses were sole proprietors or partnerships. The majority of dollars spent by people inside of a city were on individually owned or family-owned businesses. Your grocer, retailer, and hardware store were all owned by people who lived in your city. Today, your grocer, retailer, and hardware store are publicly traded companies. They're owned and headquartered in another city. Decisions on your local store are being made in a corporate headquarters outside of your city. Today, you might buy your groceries from Whole Foods, which is headquartered in Austin, Texas, your clothes from Target, which is headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and maybe your tools from Home Depot, which is headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. At the turn of the 20th century, you would have known the streets of where the owner of your grocer, retailer, and hardware store lived. Your kids would have gone to school with each other. You would have patronized their businesses, and they would patronize your business. The success of your neighborhood was the success of their neighborhood. They wanted safe and active neighborhoods because the success of the city was also the success of their business. They were just as invested in your city as you were. The urban economy was made up of a number of small businesses that really created a ownership class as a part of the social fabric of cities. Because businesses were often family-owned and operated, their value to the neighborhood was in their relationships with their neighbors. Businesses were committed to their place and the people living in them. Again, a city's decline or their neighborhood's decline meant their business's extinction. Businesses also served as the center of communication because they were located within working class neighborhoods, as opposed to today's shopping plazas. Cities had a mixture of uses in transit-oriented development before those phrases were even invented by planners. Bank portfolios at this time often consisted of safe, moderate profit loan portfolios, as opposed to chasing the highest return available at a national scale. They didn't resell a local mortgage on a secondary market. They were local banks making local transactions and invested in the local community in which they operated. Now when dollars are spent at a chain located in a city, that money actually leaves the city. The ownership of that business isn't located in that city. You live next to store number 1000, not store number 1 of 1. Chains also react to national economic trends as opposed to neighborhood needs. The way businesses were owned changed significantly in the late 19th century, moving from family-owned and operated to the joint stock corporation. The change in the way businesses were owned in the late 19th century decentralized wealth away from the center city and almost entirely from smaller industrialized cities. Firms were historically small when cities had wealth because no firm had the organizational capacity to manage a workforce of 50,000 people, nor were they able to harness enough energy to manufacture or distribute goods nationally or even worldwide. Around 1910, direct ownership was displaced as the center of the American economy by the Joint Stock Corporation and its associated institutions such as the New York Stock Exchange. Equity markets helped raise capital, giving way to the first big business in America, the railroad. The railroad created the corporate model we know today. No individual or partnership could fund a railroad project on its own. It needed capital in large quantities that were supplied through corporate stocks and bonds. Joint stock companies started to scale production like never before, building large factories that could manufacture products and distribute them worldwide. At first, these businesses were still dependent on a centralized urban economy and centralized urban development. They needed labor and capital in close proximity to one another. Some of the companies starting at this time are businesses we still know to this day: U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, Coca-Cola, Sears Roebuck, General Electric, Pepsi, Goodyear, Ford, 3M, Black & Decker, and IBM. All of these corporations were founded between 1880 and 1920. These companies, while distributing worldwide, were still very much local. They were still investing in the cities in which they were headquartered. They were selling products worldwide, but pumping that money back into the streets of their local economy. The growth of these corporations signaled stability as they continued to invest in capital in a city. It signaled to other people and other businesses that a city is safe to invest in. This resulted in more capital investments in the form of buildings, homes, city infrastructure, all in the center city. At this point in American history, wealth hadn't yet left the city. The second reason for why wealth left cities is really the change in energy and transportation systems. The rate it took to move goods before the railroad was about 62 miles per 24 hours. This rate remained the same from the Roman Empire through the birth of the railroad. Before the 1840s, businesses and people still relied on energy from wind, water, and the muscle of animals, men and women. Cities and towns at this time didn't contain factories or mills. Mills were located outside of the city in valleys where water fell more sharply to produce energy. The urban economy was diversified with small-scale handcraft producers with relatively low levels of output. After 1840, burning coal to heat steam boilers generated enough mechanical force to start producing goods at a greater scale. Goods were also now able to be transported further distances. Firms were now starting to sell nationally and globally. Cities became places where raw materials and labor accumulated most efficiently. By having a railroad station near a water port in a city center, cities connected lumber from the north with coal from the south. Cities connected capital and labor to markets across the United States and world. Manufacturing became cheaper, closer to the source of energy it needed to manufacture. The more central a business was located, the more cost efficient the business was. As 19th century immigrants moved to the United States in significant numbers, they centralized in cities where manufacturing jobs were in high demand, further concentrating housing, retailing, and daily life in the center city area. There was no high-quality variable path transportation at this time. Horses were practical only over short distances. This kept people close to the urban core right up through the 1920s. The massive workforce housing that sprung up in center cities peaked in 1920. This was developed prior to zoning and before the mass adoption of cars. These forces that created and retained wealth inside American cities were about to change. There's a connection between the consolidation of entire industries and the decline of cities post-World War II. Businesses and people left cities to go to the cheaper land in the suburbs for single-family homes, suburban corporate office parks, and even manufacturing plants. With new highways, mass adoption of the automobile, changes in corporate structures, and subsidized single-family homes, there was no more efficiency or advantage to locate in a city, and wealth fled. Wealth left cities as corporations achieved economies of scale through horizontal and vertical integration. Horizontal integration concentrated wealth into a few large cities, away from smaller cities, as multiple smaller independent firms merged into one national corporation. Vertical integration resulted in less grounded leadership in cities, as senior management and ownership consolidated into fewer positions in fewer cities. Smaller cities throughout New England and the Rust Belt lost companies that were heavily invested in their neighborhoods. Consolidation ended the independent grocers, department stores, and banks, and the senior management and ownership class that went along with it. The benefits of this are clear. The consolidation and growth at scale has provided lower prices and has commoditized the products and services that we do use every day. I'm simply noting what was lost: the local ownership, the wealth of commerce being enjoyed in the city in which business was conducted. The third reason wealth left cities is white flight. The federal government subsidized construction companies who were building single-family homes in the suburbs. As people left cities for suburbs, entire housing communities were established that were only sold to white families. The most famous is Levittown in New York, which constructed 17,000 new single-family homes in the 1950s that sold for less than $8,000 a house to only white families. The federal government insured mortgages so that banks would lend to home builders and to home buyers without the risk of default. The federal government essentially funded the mass exodus of white people and their wealth out of the city. This occurred during a time where economic and transportation forces were already decentralizing the economy and people. At the same time single-family suburbs were being subsidized, the Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorized spending $25 billion for the construction of the interstate highway system. So what have we lost as a result of people and wealth leaving cities? I think what cities really lost was people and businesses having a commitment to place. Each city, small and large, historically had a hardware store that was owned by someone who lived in that city, who patronized other companies. Consolidation led to that local store being replaced by a Home Depot. All the individual hardware companies no longer have local ownership, and ownership is consolidated into one city, in this case Atlanta, Georgia. The replacement by Home Depot means management is no longer making decisions at the local level. There's no local owner accountable at the neighborhood level. There's no commitment to place. If sales drop in that community, there's really no pivoting. The store closes and relocates to another area of the country that has a hotter market. The wealth obtained from the store leaves the community and gets funneled through their corporate headquarters. These firms don't practice reciprocal patronage. They're built not by local contractors, but by one company who builds the same building across the country with no commitment to a local workforce. Senior management of the chain owe their loyalty to the boardroom in Atlanta and not really the local city. The major institutions of cities used to center them. The church, government, schools, and commerce were all located in the city, and wealth was continuously invested in the downtown core of cities. This is true for small and large cities. So gone is the commitment to a certain place. Individual and business investment in a certain place used to give confidence to other investors and residents that a city was a trustworthy location to make commitments of their own. The city used to be full of citizens committed to that city, whether by choice, birth, economic necessity, or a combination of these things. A city would have people who lived in it, educated their children there, shopped and worshiped there, and had a social network there. People at the bottom and top of the workforce used to live in the city, in close proximity to each other. A suburban commuter is committed to that city as well, but really only in part. The suburban commuter separates their life and work as two different things, life being in the suburb and work being in the city. To summarize, transportation systems and sources of energy centralize populations and capital. Partnerships and sole proprietor business models kept wealth local. Cars and variable path transportation decentralized populations and capital. Joint stock corporations centralized wealth into fewer, larger companies, resulting in wealth leaving many industrialized cities. If you're interested in the rise and decline of cities, I highly recommend reading City, Urbanism, and Its End by WWII. A link to buy this book will be in the video description. It's one of the foundational books for my understanding of how cities, especially New England cities, grew and peaked in wealth and population, and then the forces that resulted in their decline. Subscribe to City Glow Up if you're interested in the intersection of cities, economics, government, and planning.